It all started with a letter. An old cottage, almost overtaken by flora and fungi, is suddenly greeted by a small parcel with a letter attached. The letter reads, "Dear Grandma Brea, how are you? I hope this letter finds you well. I'm currently writing this on the boat back to Port Artefel, so I apologize if my writing gets messy. But I finally finished my gift for you, and I could not wait to get it all ready to be sent to you as soon as I hit land. Sending spells are a little tricky to do on a rocking boat, but I want to make sure I do it right. Not like last time. Still trying to track down that last parcel I sent you. Vin is doing okay and keeping me company as always, snuggled up next to me as I write this. He always keeps saying hello and starts conversations as if you're going to answer back straight away. I don't think my little feline familiar understands how letters work, but I'm sure he'll get it eventually. This is only the 20th letter we've sent. Enclosed in this parcel is a book, a journal to help me keep track of all the wonderful plants and flowers I've discovered as I've been on my journey to become a better witch. I know how much you love your plants, and since you haven't been able to travel around Aezura as much as you'd like, I thought I'd try and bring the flowers to you. Though I've still got a ways to go yet, I hope one day I can become as good of a witch as you. Lots of love and hugs. Hetty. And Vin." Hello, and welcome to the sketchbook tour of my Alphabet Superset challenge. This has been a while in the making, so I had to dress firm for the occasion, but I'm so excited to properly talk through how I came up with the ideas for each of these flowers, and some of the little details that I couldn't quite fit into the reels, and also some flower ideas that didn't quite make the list. If you haven't seen the short videos that I made for this challenge, there's a playlist set up already that takes you through each flower from A to Z. This is probably going to be a long one, so grab some snacks and a bev, and without further ado, let's jump into the Botanist's Guide to Aezura. So, I tried to come up with a few ideas before we officially started the challenge to give myself an easier time each week with coming up with ideas. And one of the first ideas was a flower that is so small it is practically undetectable unless you have a way of detecting magic. And that is how the Aezura was created. I wanted them to look quite airy and light, almost translucent, so I made the overall outline of the flower a lighter grey, and tried to fade out parts of the stem to make it look only just visible at certain angles. I actually really like this gradient technique on the outline, and I want to try it for future illustrations outside of this project as well. The Bedelda has one of my favourite use cases for flowers. It's basically a way for travellers to tell time in cases where they couldn't use the sun or the stars. For example, when you are travelling through a cave. I like to think if you become really familiar with the flower, you can tell what the exact hour is by how much each of the petals, or each pair of the petals, is open by. But a simple telling of which set of petals is in bloom to tell you whether it's night or day is still probably quite useful, especially when you're in the caves. This is also where I start playing around with adding dithering and gradients to that dither to mimic the shadows of the flower. And you'll be seeing a lot more of this in the rest of the flowers as well, as I really like this technique. For Kaladir's song, I wanted to introduce flowers that are specific to a location in the world of Aezura, and start to build up that world that is behind all of these flowers. Because the city of Kaladir is so well hidden within the mountains, adventurers would use these flowers as waypoints to help them direct themselves towards the city, which can be especially useful in harsher conditions like snowstorms. I also started using the dithering techniques for other details too, like the wind passing through the holes in the stem, that would play the notes for Kaladir's song. I was really proud of the name for Dragon Mint, which feels really silly to say, but the rumor of this flower is that it was used as a way to stop a dragon from breathing fire, and so the cooling effects of mint made sense to be part of the name as well. I probably could have incorporated the classic mint leaf shape either into the shape of the flower petals or the leaves themselves, but I actually quite like the silhouette of this one because it sort of reminds me of a dragon that is standing tall with like the long leaves acting as the wings, which I thought was a cool little hint there. I remember Echo Root being a pretty fun one to draw and come up with the backstory for it. The inspiration for this was a mix between the two cans that are attached to a string and then you shout in one to hear the message through the other, and also just like walkie-talkies in general, but I really like the idea of this in the form of a flower. I wanted the shape of the flower to also emphasize this idea of sounds and talking, so I tried to make the silhouette the shape of a megaphone, or in this case, a few megaphones stacked on top of each other. But I also wanted to mimic that ethereal, invisible connection of the roots, so that these two flowers are always connected no matter how far away they are. And I used a similar method before by adding a sort of gradient between those roots. A cool deal about the roots is that even though they are practically invisible, if you're far enough away from either plant, you're still able to see the connection if you are familiar with that type of magic. It made me think that there could be some sort of item that lets you see the connections of all echo root plants in some way, like a web-like structure. Kind of like a weird Find My iPhone, but make it D&D. Philodon was almost a completely different flower at first. In my original list of ideas, I had a flower nicknamed Fool's Gold, which was a flower that was regarded as highly sought out and was harvested essentially out of its value because it was so sought after. But I wanted to have something that was related to making either dye or ink using the pigment from petals, as I feel like that would be a common use case that hasn't been explored yet. For some reason, my mind kept thinking of the word filigree, which is a form of intricate metalwork, so I tried to incorporate the idea of intricate patterns into the pockets of pigment that are on the petals. I also, not related to the flower, but I love the little paw prints on the page. It starts to show a bit of the personality for Hetty's cat familiar Vin, and how he has sort of a mischievous side, and this made me want to try and get more of these sort of little interactions within the journal entries, and tell a bit more of the story about their journey discovering the flowers as well. With flowers being a super common gift, it felt when you write that the flower for G was a special gift in some way, and that's how Gray's favor came to be. I wanted to try and tie the flowers more into the journey as well, so this became a gift of thanks for returning one half of the Echo Root pair to its original owner, and the Gray's favor is almost like a good luck charm that is from the Kingdom of Gray. I wanted the shape of the flower to represent luck, like a four-leaf clover, and I think it works pretty well here. Because these are grown on vines along the castle, I could definitely see them being harvested still on the vine so that the person who receives the flower can use the vine as a way to attach it to either their bag or their clothing, whatever they're vibing with. Hummingbloom actually started as a name for the druid grove that is able to druid craft this particular flower, and they are called the Humming Circle. I thought it would be cool if these flowers are used as some sort of like alarm system for the grove, and their means of security was sort of embedded in nature itself. A big part of the druid's training in that grove is learning to listen to the sounds of nature through meditation, and eventually feel the subtle vibrations that these flowers give off in their roots. With enough practice, they can understand what disruptions are from small animals and that are harmless, and ones that are more unusual and can pose a threat. Which is why the root network takes up a big part of the page, as it's such an important part to the flower. The flower sort of acts more as almost like a decoy, because it blends so well into the forest, and the root is the main function of the flower, which I thought was quite nice as a sort of reverse to most of the other flowers. Icelos is one of the more common flowers, at least in colder climates. The purpose of this flower is mostly medicinal, with the cooling effect used to reduce inflammation, and in some less common uses, could be used as a potion ingredient for fire resistance. I like to think that the petals are like icicles and could be crushed into a powder, and I wanted to try and create that harder texture with the dithering, which I don't think I quite nailed with this, but the general shape of the petals and the shape of the flower itself I think helps sell the idea. Good enough. The thought process of this one really mirrored the appearance of Jolteria, which, not intended, but a cool observation. The original idea for the flower for Jay was something jewel related, either being incredibly expensive and rare for its jewel-like appearance, or as a common way to craft jewelry between different druid groves. But for some reason, I really wanted to make a flower with only one petal and sort of figure out how that would work. Don't ask where this thought came from, I have no idea, but the jewels idea was definitely not going to work with this one, unfortunately. This then turned into a spiral of thinking of words that began with J, and I landed on the word jolt, which then all tied together as a natural sort of spiraling lightning rod that people would plant to protect their homes from storms. I wish I could have captured the height of these flowers because they're actually meant to be really tall so that they would be the most likely object to be struck by lightning first, but if I drew them to size, then it would not fit on the page. All you would see is the stem of it, but that's fine. So the flower for K was actually meant to be a part of a pair of flowers for both K and Q, which would each be for a king and a queen. But I couldn't get the idea to work in the way that I wanted at the time, and I was overcomplicating it in my head, so I decided to just simplify it and go back to the drawing board of other words that began with K, and I ended up landing on kite. Kites and festival seem to go pretty well together, and using flowers in a festival made a lot of sense as well, so the idea just sort of gelled together really well, and having them as sort of the main event at the end of a festival felt very fitting. Since flowers and festivals go so well together, you'll be seeing a couple more in this collection, but coming up with the festival that goes along with the flower and the significance of the flower is always fun to brainstorm and think about. I had a lot of options for words beginning with L. I had laugh, I had love. Was not aiming for like a live, laugh, love flower, but you know, the option was there. But legend or lord and lady were all fun options that I could see being pretty cool flower ideas, but for some reason levitate as a word really stood out to me. I could have had it as another potion ingredient to make you float. I feel like potion ingredients were definitely like a backup for weeks where I wasn't sure what sort of flower I wanted to make, but I wanted this to be something that's a bit more functional, which is where the idea of them being sort of little air balloons came around, and I feel like that's very useful for the treetop village that you find them in. Unintentionally, this looks like the house from Up, or it looks like it could be used in the same situation as the house from Up, with all the balloons, but, you know, we roll with it. I'm sure there's a D&D equivalent of that. Initially, I thought of a musical flower for M Week, but I'd already did a few sound-related flowers at this point, and I liked the idea of playing around with the conditions that caused a flower to bloom, like with the Bedelda and the different times of day causing it to bloom. So I thought I'd do something similar here, where the flower blooms depending on what the weather is like. Each type of flower has a different color of petals, so then they can form these different murals on the ground depending on the weather, though that is quite hard to show in this format. But I really like the idea of reusing space. I feel like that's something that is quite inherent to the village of Honeymere, since they don't have a lot of floor space, because most of the village is made up in the trees for safety. I feel like having these little moments of peacefulness with like these beautiful murals is just like a nice practical way that they can like express themselves creatively. I'm just gonna pause the video here because this video is quite long and I propose we have a little water break. How y'all doing? Can't believe we've hit the halfway mark already, but make sure you have a quick stretch and unshrimp if you need to, and we'll get back into the sketchbook tour. According to my notes, this was the last flower for 2023. Following my thoughts around the different ways that a flower could bloom, I thought about what if there is a flower that we haven't found out how it blooms yet, and so no one has actually seen this flower out of its bud form. I wanted this idea to be reflected in the flower, with parts of the stem covering over the bud, sort of like a cage. Botanists have tried all sorts to try and force the flower to bloom, but perhaps there's some secrets of this world that I keep only to myself. Or that I don't actually know myself yet, but you didn't hear that. I didn't realize until looking back, but quite a few flowers are either in Honeymere or nearby it, but it does make a lot of sense as it's a village of druids, so they would naturally be able to use flowers in creative ways just by being so attuned to nature. I wanted at least one flower to be related to the different planes in the world of Aezura, and be able to hint that there is also a Fey realm in this world as well. I wanted the shape of the flower to represent the pixie silhouette, and with the 2 extra petals at the top to sort of look like their wings. I kind of wish I did more flowers that are related to Fey, because the Fey realm is just so interesting to me, but hey, can always be a volume 2 of this book, you never know. I really like the idea of a flower with a way more powerful use case that barely anyone knows, and that they're actually used in a much more casual sense. I tried to keep the motif of flames in the shape of the petals, and a little smaller flower acting as like a little campfire inside of the main flower too. But this also has sort of a double meaning of rebirth, like a phoenix rising from the ashes, as there's one flower sort of within another that's just about to grow, so I'm quite happy with how this one turned out and the fun little double meanings behind it. Q surprisingly had quite a few ideas. Some words I thought of were question, like a flower that is a mixture of a magic 8-ball and sort of tea leaves. It was almost called the Queen's Thorn, which was named after a queen who defended her throne using only this flower or the thorns of the flower. But I didn't quite know how to make this work, as I mentioned before, and it got a bit too complicated. But I did want to have a flower that is related to an adventuring party, as a little ode to the party in my D&D game that I run. They're not called the Spirited 7, but there has been 7 player characters so far. I really like the map pattern on this petal, and I like to think that the pattern is actually part of the missing piece of a much bigger map, and that's why they needed to find the flower to lead them to a more powerful item that they use to save the realm. For the R flower, I wanted to have a flower that was related to Hetty and Vin, something that doesn't have a super grand meaning to the wider world, but it was just special to them. I realized I hadn't done a flower that was used in food or products in some way, like infusing flowers into honey or adding flowers to soap. But that's such a common thing in real life, at least from the soap perspective. I've never really tried flower-infused honey, but sounds pretty good. I wanted the flower to have like a really thick petal, because I thought that would make sense for where the oil is produced. And since the Rivermoors are a family of botanists who over the years have created this flower into like a hybrid to produce the most amount of oils and sort of make a business around it, it made a lot of sense in that context. For S Week, I originally wanted to create a flower around silence, either with it emitting an aura where no sound could be detected around it, or it's a spell component for potions that would have a similar effect. But eventually I settled on a flower that was related to shooting stars, and being the result of an aftermath when a star crashes into the land. Is it a star? I don't know if it's a star or a comet. Either way, I wanted the silhouette of the flower to sort of emphasize this by almost looking like a shooting star, with the trail behind it being the stem of the flower. For the use case of this flower, I imagine that they could be contained in jars as like little light sources. As they only give off an intense glow at night, it would sort of be like a self-sufficient lantern. I did a bit of brainstorming with chat on my Twitch stream for Tea Week. I knew that I wanted it to be time-related in some way. Something that could either speed up or slow down time really appealed to me. So the curl of the flowers made the most sense, with one direction being clockwise would speed up time and anti-clockwise would slow down time. This was all done with sort of an aura that is emitted from the flower, and artificers in that world wanted to try and figure out how to make that bigger and make it useful in some cases. And I'd like to think that they tried to work with botanists to try and create a hybrid of this flower that would create a bigger aura. and maybe that the Rivermore family was asked to do it, but they just wanted to stick to their family business. They don't want to get involved in unusual business. I don't really know what the word would be, but something that doesn't sit right with them. So they just stuck to their little honey and soap business. But this also gave me a chance to introduce the idea of artificers in the world and show that there are some more technical elements to the world that still interact with nature in some way. U week, which sounds really weird, but the letter U had quite a few ideas, which I was surprised about because I thought the letter U didn't have that many words to work with, but I was happy to be shown wrong. But some options that I thought about was something underwater related or underground, like a potato that emerges at some point, or potentially a flower that showed the union of two nations, or like an umbrella that was made of giant petals. So, you know, we had quite a mix of options with this one. But the final flower, Umadil, was actually inspired by the Jellyfish Festival in Stardew Valley. I think at this part, I had started playing Stardew Valley, like on this week of the project, and I was playing it a lot, so it makes sense that I was getting inspired by it. But I just rolled with the idea and linked it with a festival that was relating to the change of seasons. And so these flowers would emerge all along the coast of the ocean and form a beautiful glowing blanket across the sea for one night only. And I really like the shape of these flowers because it reminds me of like fish tails that are emerging out of the water, so I think it fit the theme of the flower really well. For the letter V, this was actually another one that we worked on stream. We actually started with the name of this one, which was suggested by chat, but I wasn't sure what the purpose of this flower would be. It ended up being quite a functional flower, where it could absorb the heat of hotter climates, and then that heat would create a red gradient on the petals, which I wish I could have shown in the drawing more, but maybe I'll try adding color to a few of the flowers where it makes sense because it adds to the purpose of the flower. But I like to think that these flowers could also be brought into the homes in the evening, so when it's colder, they can also emit the heat that they've stored inside the home and sort of warm it up, because we love a flower with multiple functions. I always thought that I'd do something water related for a W, but then Umadil happened, and so I wanted to try something a little different. I hadn't done anything with the dew that can be found on flowers, so I went down a bit of a rabbit hole of researching how water is created through condensation, and that's how the willow dew came together. What most people don't know about the dew that's produced from these flowers is that it can make a potion effect last longer, or be more effective if it's mixed in with the potion. But I like to think that this is sort of a hint that Grandma Brea tells Hetty after she gets back and they sort of look through the book together. There are not a lot of words that begin with X, so we stuck with the easiest and we went with something that is related to a xylophone. This is probably one of the more unique shapes for a flower, but I really like the idea behind it. The stems are hollow, so you can make a note when they're tapped against a hard surface, kind of like a drumstick and the steel drum mixed together, and the length of these stems determines the pitch of the note. I like to think that bards who are proficient with this and can play these as an instrument have some sort of gloves that have a lot of these flowers with different length stems attached so that they can play entire songs with the gloves, which I think could be quite cool. Maybe I'll try and make a drawing of it. I don't know. This one is quite a nostalgic flower for me. Because I was thinking a lot about picking flowers as a kid, especially daisies, and making them into like little daisy chains, and I wanted this flower to have that same vibe, and that's where the idea of a flower that could be used as a yo-yo appeared. I like to think that this is something that just the kids discovered on their own. They just started like picking off the leaves and found that the shape of the flower works really well as a yo-yo. I think that would be quite nice as a little discovery. I also realized that I made quite a few of these flowers, like a toy for Vin to play around with, and luckily this one is pretty hardy and can take a couple hits, which then made me think about when I played, I think it's called Conkers, where you basically have conkers that are tied to a string, and like you hit them off one another to like until one of the conkers breaks. Wild tangent, but It was the brainwave that I was on when I was thinking about this. But I think that these flowers could also probably be used for that game as well. Though it's a bit more destructive. I imagine the kids in Silanor who discovered these flowers are pretty creative and probably have quite a few games that are related to this flower. For the final flower, I wanted it to tie to the very beginning of the journey, with it being a spell component for sending objects very far distances, like perhaps a journal with a letter. And I think the way that you have to use the petals as part of the spell is to actually line up the pattern of lines on the petals, sort of like a little puzzle, which I thought would be a fun way to use them in the ritual casting of the spell. One thing I do miss from this, which I've mentioned a couple times, is adding color to these flowers. I think it would have overwhelmed me if I did try to do that, so I do think it was the right decision to keep these sort of monochromatic. But I imagine this flower could actually be like a deep purple, similar to the night sky, and where you can see the ley lines in this world, which are what inspired the different lines and the patterns on the petals themselves. And that is the entire series of journal entries. I hope you've enjoyed this little trip through Aezura and memory lane for the past few months. This was the first big art project that I've ever completed, and I really did have a blast making this. I wanted to thank y'all for coming along with me on this journey, and your lovely comments on the shorts for these flowers really did make my day. Let me know what your favorite flower was from the series, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care out there. Goodbye!